One of the biggest lies people believe about manipulation is this, that manipulators look for weak people. They don't. In fact, some of the easiest people to manipulate are kind. The people who say, it's okay, even when it isn't. The people who forgive too quickly, who give second chances, who ignore the voice in their head just to keep the peace. And manipulators know this because manipulation rarely starts with force. It starts with guilt, with urgency, with emotional pressure, and sometimes with a smile. The classic, I'm only doing this because I care about you. Because sometimes the people who say they care the most are the same people trying the hardest to control your choices. But then there are people manipulators quietly avoid, not because they're aggressive, not because they're intimidating, but because certain traits make them incredibly difficult to control. And here's the funny part. Most of these people don't even realize they have those traits. They think they're just normal, direct, low tolerance for nonsense. But to a manipulator, you're basically a psychological door with 12 locks and a dog growling behind it. Today, we're going to break down 5 signs you're one of them. And trust me, the last one frustrates manipulators more than almost anything else. The first sign is subtle. But once you notice it, you can't unsee it. You question things before you believe them. You don't automatically accept something because it was said confidently or emotionally or by someone with what I like to call leader energy. You know the type, the serious face, the dramatic pauses, the deep voice, like every sentence should be engraved into stone. Meanwhile, you're sitting there thinking, wait, does that even make sense? And that's exactly the problem. Manipulation loves speed. It wants your emotions driving the car and your logic locked in the trunk. But you do the opposite. You slow down, you observe, you ask questions. And surprisingly, some people get really uncomfortable when you ask questions. Not because you're difficult, but because your curiosity is inconvenient. Because honest people explain, manipulative people pressure. And manipulators don't fear stubborn people. They fear people who think. But thinking clearly doesn't protect everyone, because plenty of people know something feels wrong and still go along with it. Not because they're naive, but because disappointing others feels harder than disappointing themselves. Which leads to the second sign. You can say no without writing a dissertation. Seriously. Some people act like saying no requires a full explanation, supporting documents, a bibliography, and maybe a signed letter from 3 witnesses. You don't. You've learned something that takes many people years to understand. I don't want to is a complete sentence. And manipulators hate that because people who control others rely heavily on a few buttons: guilt, fear of rejection, emotional pressure, or the timeless masterpiece, after everything I've done for you. Which is interesting, because kindness isn't supposed to come with monthly repayments. But manipulators often treat it like a loan. And if you don't obey, suddenly you're selfish, ungrateful, cold. Funny how quickly love turns into accusations when control stops working. But you don't apologize for having boundaries. You understand that protecting your peace isn't selfish, and saying no doesn't make you cruel. It means you've stopped betraying yourself just to keep other people comfortable. And honestly, the people who get angry at your boundaries are often the people who benefited most from you having none. But boundaries alone aren't enough, because manipulators rarely reveal themselves immediately. At first, they say all the right things, they make promises, they act sincere. And that's why the third sign matters so much. You pay attention to inconsistencies. You hear words, but you trust behavior because words are cheap. Anyone can say, you can trust me. Anyone can promise change. Anyone can swear they're different and then proceed to do exactly what they promised they wouldn't do, repeatedly, with confidence, and somehow act shocked that you noticed. But you do notice. You notice warmth when they want something and distance once they get it. You notice promises that never become action. You notice people with high morals in public and questionable behavior in private. And here's the best part. You don't always confront them. You don't need a dramatic speech. You don't gather screenshots. You don't start an FBI investigation. You simply adjust your distance quietly. Because manipulators depend on people ignoring red flags. You don't ignore them. You file them away. And once you see the pattern, you move differently. But spotting manipulative people isn't the hardest part. The hardest part is not needing them. And that's the fourth sign. You're not starving for validation. That doesn't mean rejection doesn't hurt. It does. You're human. You care. You love deeply. You value connection. But you don't need someone else's approval to feel worthy. And that changes everything. Because here's something manipulators understand surprisingly well. If your happiness depends entirely on being chosen, you become easier to control. Then every disagreement feels like abandonment. Every boundary feels dangerous. Every silence feels terrifying. And slowly, you start negotiating your own dignity just to keep someone around. You tolerate disrespect. You ignore things you swore you'd never accept. You make excuses for behavior that would make your past self sit in a corner and whisper, "What exactly are we doing here?" Because losing them feels unbearable. But when your self-worth comes from within, the game changes. You'll lose me. Okay, that's information, not a threat. And sometimes a relief. Because losing the wrong people isn't failure, it's freedom. And if there is one thing manipulators hate more than boundaries, it's silence. This is the fifth sign, and perhaps the strongest of them all. Your silence is a wall. Manipulators need reactions. They need your anger, your long paragraphs, your emotional explanations at 2 in the morning. They need you defending yourself, explaining yourself, begging to be understood. Because emotions are easier to manipulate than facts. But you don't feed the chaos. You observe, you wait, you decide when to speak. And when you do, it's not to prove your worth. It's not to win an argument. It's to make a decision. Your silence isn't weakness. It's emotional discipline. It's refusing to fight in an arena where the other person has spent years mastering emotional games. And silence isn't swallowing your feelings. It's refusing to hand ammunition to someone who treats every disagreement like a war. Because manipulators fear one thing above all else, someone they cannot provoke. Because if they can't control your emotions, eventually they lose control of you. Because manipulators don't hate your boundaries. They hate what your boundaries reveal. That their guilt no longer works. Their pressure no longer scares you. Their approval is no longer necessary. And once someone loses the ability to control you, they often accuse you of changing. Maybe you did. Because being hard to manipulate isn't becoming colder. It isn't distrusting everyone. It isn't building walls around your heart. It's finally refusing to abandon yourself just to keep someone else.